I'm Bruce Flaherty. I'm 88 years old. Today is the 23rd day of June, '09. This is Elmira, New York, and I worked with these two guys. We were the news department at WSYE television.
Oh, my name's Carl Proper. I'm 71, day before yesterday. Today is June 23rd, 2009, here in Elmira. And I'm related to these other two characters by the fact that we worked together for a gazillion years in the TV broadcast industry.
I'm Rod Denson, age 67. Today is June 20th, and I'm in Elmira, New York. And I have worked with these two gentlemen for nearly 25 years, from about 1963 until 1989 at WSYE Television Channel 18 in Elmira.
And it's also called WETM TV.
It's now WETM.
Because I'm the last one who graduated from that esteemed place.
I was the news director at the time that the Agnes flood hit. Rod and Carl were out in the field covering the stories, shooting film, interviewing people. I sat high up on Hawley Hill trying to put the whole thing together. When did you two gentlemen begin to realize that we were facing something of a catastrophe?
Well, I'll start that by saying that we heard on scanners, didn't we, that there was flooding various places, and he and I went out down in Big Flats, which is an area adjacent to Elmira.
Can we start a little earlier than that?
Oh, sure.
If you're talking about Thursday, let's start with Wednesday, because Wednesday is when I got a call from our studio cameraman, Keith Spencer, that he'd heard that there was some flooding in the Hornell area, Canasteo area. So
we're downstream from that area.
Yes, we were. So I went and picked up our new photographer. I think it was his first day on the job, Dave Levine, and the two of us headed with our camera and tape recorder to the Canasteo area. And on the way there, I remember telling Dave, I said, keep looking for side roads and remember where they are, because the river's getting higher and I'm not sure we can go, to Canasteo, and we weren't able to get there. We didn't have to use any escape roads, fortunately, but I remember getting to outside of Canasteo, and already homes and house trailers were being flooded and people were evacuating, and we couldn't get into Canasteo because the river was already over the banks, but we did get some video and then headed back toward Elmira, and that was on Wednesday. So I first became aware of it probably late morning on Wednesday. Then Thursday is when you and I were out, and we're going to Bendix up in the Heights,
right? And
then we were out on Route 352, and you have some stories about that out by the Elmira Drive-In.
Right. There's a low spot in the road on Route 352. It's called Frenchman's Curve.
Did I call it Route 328?
I don't know.
I don't know, but it's Route 352.
352. At our age, you can goof up every once in a while. But anyway, we were there at Frenchman's Curve. The water was there. We also went down the big curve into Big Flats. Water was coming up there. And the time is not, clear in my mind whether we went back to Big Flats, and we've covered it all day long. And I don't know, is at that time I had a feeling that we were going to have a disaster, or even that it was a disaster. It has flooded before in Big Flats.
Oh, yeah.
It's flooded across Frenchman's Curve. So at that point,
almost a spring occurrence.
Yes. So I was feeling that this was a story, but not a disaster at that time.
And then on Thursday, I believe it was, the Binghamton Weather Bureau said it's a flood.
Right.
And by that time, we already had flooding up in, service flooding up in the Heights around Bendix. Eldridge Park, I think, was probably
Which floods every spring.
No.
Right.
Well, did the flood have any personal impact on either of you?
Well, I didn't get much sleep.
Carl got marooned,
Yeah, well, I left
stranded
work.
in Athens.
I left work Friday and headed home. I lived at that time about...
Actually, you left home Thursday because the flood was Friday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very
You're
much,
welcome.
Rod. Appreciate that. Anyway, I started home and down in front of the Tomahawk Restaurant, which was on Route 17, the Southern Tier Expressway. State troopers were guiding the cars off of the state highway and up onto a railroad overpass. Well, actually a railroad cut where the rails and the sleepers had been removed, and they let us drive along there until we got the other side of where the water was, and I got back on the road and went uneventfully to Athens, and nothing was happening down there. I lived on Tioga Point, which is about the 16th of a mile from where the Chemung River and the Susquehanna River, which rises in Cooperstown and flows down through Binghamton, that also is flooding at the same time, but not there. One stream was on one side of the house.
Reached there, but it got there.
Yeah, oh yes, it got there eventually. We were awakened the next morning, and early the next morning, with sirens and car horns and bull horns, and we were evacuated from there to a friend's house in Athens, and we were there watching the water come up. And it's an interesting thing about floods, water seeking its own level. What you have in mind is what's level and what the water has in mind.
Quite different.
Yes, we're standing there looking at the water going, hey, here comes the water. Oh, look at that. It's flooding over. And somebody turned around and looked in the other direction and said, we better get out of here because the water's crossed the road behind us.
Remember how people judged how the fast it was coming up? I remember people like placing a rock at the edge of the water and then watching it disappear. You know, you put another rock and wait for it to go under. And
it didn't reach your home
it didn't reach my home, but I didn't know that until Saturday. I was able to get back across the river. But no, Thursday night, I remember being quite concerned that, because I had been seeing the rains, and it was persistent. Remember the persistent rainfall, very humid. In fact, I think the day or two before the flood, it was like 90 degrees, very, very hot.
There it was humid, yes.
Yeah, but then it got humid and rained a lot. But Thursday night, I remember thinking, this is not good. And back then, we didn't have the super digital scanners that are available now. I think I had an old Helicrafters tunable receiver tuned to the sheriff's department, the city police. I think they were both so close that if I tuned between them, I could hear each agency. But I remember not wanting to go to sleep, and I remember sitting in a lounge chair listening to the scanner, trying to stay awake. And finally, about 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday, they started announcing that they needed to evacuate people around Brand Park because they think there was a leak in the dike. It kind of sprung a leak, so they started evacuating people, and they moved them to Southside High School. So actually, in preparation for it, I'd already packed my station wagon with sleeping bags, Coleman stoves, lanterns. I think I attached the boat to it, and we were ready to go. So I realized that I needed to get to the station. Things were getting worse. So I got my wife Midge up and my 3 kids, Rodney, Lisa, and Mark, and we got them in the car, and I stopped at Southside High School. I remember it was difficult to get video because my camera had been so wet from the various rains that it was starting to get fogged up the lens, so the video was not the best. But I stopped at Southside as the people were being ushered in with their sleeping bags and pillows from home. That was a center for the people, that were losing their homes and had no place to go. It was a shelter. Anyway, I got filmed there. This is maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:30. And then I started north on Main Street and had the radio on. And as I headed north toward the river, they officially closed the Main Street Bridge. But I had no choice. I needed to get to the television station, so I drove over the bridge moments later, and by then I think the water was within a foot of topping the dikes. Got my family to the television station on Holly Hill. I think before I left, I actually called the chief engineer and asked him if he could go in and turn the transmitter on. So when I got up there, I could start making announcements, and I did. We started broadcasting an hour or two before our normal sign-on time, and trying to get information from the various people like NYSEG and to see what was happening power-wise and such.
Let me ask you a question. We were still using 16 millimeter negative film, weren't we at that time?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we didn't have video.
Didn't
per
get
se.
a first video camera came in 1976.
Right.
Yeah, several years later.
Yeah.
So everything was on film, but and I was a photographer at the time, but I didn't get much film because I was at the station doing bulletins that
You
morning.
were doing bulletins all
until
that time.
about mid-afternoon.
Let me just interject with my personal experience. I realized it was a flood 3 o'clock in the morning on that Friday. My house was well above the floodplain, but we were getting groundwater seeping into the cellar. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I was trying to bail out my cellar, and I had the police radio with me when I heard one of the officers say, "It's coming over the wall at Lyman Gridley's." Gridley was a car sales just east of Lake Street on Water Street.
On the eastern edge of the
That
city.
was the first that I heard that it was actually into the city.
Yeah, I remember that conversation. It was pretty spooky.
Yeah.
I stayed. We were on the air, and we had 2 telephone lines at the time. One of those eventually went, but also during the early morning hours, the fire department where everybody, City Hall. I don't remember now specifically where everybody had accumulated, the officials.
Everybody was at City Hall.
And then because the water, eventually got...
Water was coming up the steps at City Hall.
They moved the command post to the McGraw building at Elmira College.
Right.
And that became the nerve center of the whole rescue and operation.
So early that morning, what were you reporting? What kind of information were you telling people?
I was, trying to give them weather information from the National Weather Service on flood forecasts and such that they had been projecting. But eventually the teletype machine, which was tied into telephone lines at the time, that went out, so I didn't have that as a source. Then I would use the telephone to call the command post to find out, because that's where all the police and firemen were, officials were gathered together, the civil defense director and such. And they would give me as much information as they could when I called. But eventually I lost the telephone line, and so I lost my teletype, the telephone line. But I remember calling the McGraw Center, and actually a reporter from the competition, WSYE, was there, and he would feed me information, knowing that they were off the air. So at some points, we were the only broadcast facility on the air. The radio stations that got flooded out.
We were on the air because we were fed from 2 directions.
And let me point out, all of our facilities were on Holly Hill, west of the
1,400
city,
feet.
one of the higher elevations in Chemung County.
And our electricity was fed both from Big Flats and down by your house on Hillcrest Road.
So we maintained actually power, and we were on the air until someone had an accident, hit a utility pole, and took us off the air for an hour or two. But other than that, we were on the air continuously during that period.
And eventually, they brought all of the shortwave equipment up onto Holly Hill. And
School buses parked in our parking lot with their radio systems were put into use.
Volunteers with their citizens band radios.
They also had
the ham operators.
Ham operators. I remember operating
every tabletop and desktop in our building, I think,
covered with
had a
radios.
radio of some sort on it.
Yeah, I remember at one point trying to find 4 nuns who their chapter in Rochester was trying to locate them. And you know, I was on every radio trying to figure out where these 4 nuns had gone, and eventually we found them. They were safe. So
That was one of the things that we got involved with, trying to track down people. We were one of the few sources of information.
very true, very true.
The view from Holly Hill we were talking about, you mentioned our facilities. I went outside just to take a break at some point and just looked south toward Wellsburg, and it just
It was
looked
just
like
a huge lake out
lake
there.
with trees and islands. Yeah, it was amazing.
We could also get over onto Harris Hill, which overlooked the entire valley. The Chemung Valley curves from the west to almost dead east, comes around a big hill, and from Harris Hill you can look down into the valley, which goes in a northerly direction, northeast, and you could see the river was flooded all the way from Corning all the way down. Everybody along that river got whacked, and eventually I got back into Elmira and worked with you guys, but that was long after the water had gone down. You were there right during the worst part of it.
Do you have specific memories? There are things that stick in my mind. The smell of the flood mud.
Oh yes, yeah. One of the things that sticks in my mind is that point, and we talked about it before, that point at which I recognized that we were in a disaster. And that was the morning when I kept moving. I was evacuated to the other side of Athens toward higher ground. Water came up there. I was evacuated a little further north. Water came up there. I was finally evacuated into Waverly, which is at the bottom of a hill, and the water didn't get that high. So at that point, we were living with relatives who happened to be living in Waverly, and everything else was cut off. If it wasn't flooded, it was at least cut off. There were little islands of dry spots, my house being one of them. The neighbor's house had 6 foot of water in the basement, only because that's, you know, same thing that happened to you, that static water came up in your basement, came up in our friend's basement next door.
You mentioned the fact that you never realized about the hills and the dips and everything.
Exactly.
The thing that still strikes me, our competition then was WENY, was based in the Mark Twain Hotel.
Mark Twain Hotel.
The first floor of the Mark Twain Hotel had an inch or two of water in it. And it's only a block away from the river. Yet 3 blocks to the north, cars in the Sears parking lot were submerged to their rooftops.
Right.
That far away from the river. So obviously the land rose away from the river, then dipped again, and then came back up again.
I guess for people like us and the newspaper, the fact that an elevated railway runs through the middle of Elmira at least gave us a chance to be in the center of the flooding and get at least coverage of what was happening downtown at that time. Some very dramatic pictures in our local newspaper of people, you know, struggling against the floodwaters.
I remember Friday leaving the station. Bruce got up to the hill eventually, and I left with a camera to get on and get filmed down in the city. I remember arriving at North Main Street where Pudgy's Pizza is, and getting in a boat with firemen at that point, and taking a motorboat down North Main Street past the Sears parking lot.
Gee, you got to do all the neat things.
Yeah, and then we took a left onto Church Street, and
Still in the motorboat.
Still in the motorboat, and went across Church Street to Madison Avenue, turned and went south on Madison Avenue, still in the boat, and pulled the boat right up to the front steps of St. Joseph's Hospital. I think on Market Street was their front entrance at the time. And at that point, helicopters were landing on one of the tops of one of the buildings at St. Joseph's, because
They were evacuating patients
yeah,
by helicopter.
yeah, to other facilities.
Yeah, and there wasn't a landing area on top of St. Joseph's Hospital, but they made one, and it worked.
In an emergency?
Another landing area I remember was helicopters landing, I think, on the lawn of Elmira College, where they were getting sandbags or something.
They also landed up in Horseheads when Vice President Spiro Agnew came to
Which
represent the
brings me
president.
to my next line.
Yeah.
I was there for the news conference, for the meetings with all of the officials, and I can still hear in my mind Elmira's Mayor Dick Lull saying to the Vice President of the U.S., Spiro Agnew, "You guys in Washington got to get off your butts and get us some help."
I think that was everybody's thought.
I didn't think you talked to a high official like that.
I guess when you're in the middle of a flood and everything is falling apart, you use anything you can to get what you can. I was there, took pictures. In fact, I just looked at a handful of them the other day, and there's a picture of the mayor of that time, Dick Lull, and the vice president, and all the Secret Service people, and you were in the picture, and it was...
I remember being in that classroom where the vice president spoke to the group, and I had a sound on film camera. Then we upgraded to we could actually record voice on this camera, but it had a big 400-foot film magazine, which had to be loaded in the dark. So once one reel ended, I had to take it off, dismount it from the camera, put it into a black bag to change and put new film in. And I was so afraid that the Secret Service would think I was up to something not good. But I think they had probably seen that happen before.
Do you remember carrying that monster camera into the McGraw building and doing an interview with Joe Sartori?
Yes.
Joe Sartori had been appointed city manager only a month before the flood hit.
Right.
He did a fantastic job, too.
And by the time we got a chance to interview him, the flood was 3 or 4 days behind us. And I can remember a very weary Joe Sartori saying, "I think we're just about out of it now."
Yeah.
He was worn out.
No, he hadn't had much sleep in those days either. No. We all put in a lot of time doing whatever we had to do to respond to this catastrophe. And did you get much chance to get sleep? I know we sacked out up on the hill. And
One good thing, we did away with neckties.
oh yes, I wish we could have kept that, you know, the fact that we didn't have to wear
For
neckties.
about 10 days, we dressed very casually. But we were walking around in the mud, too.
Yeah.
Dick Lull may not have been too happy with the federal government and their response, but I remember the mayor and I think all of the city councilmen from Corpus Christi, Texas, came here because they had been through a hurricane and flooding and a disaster. So they came to Elmira to offer their assistance and help the local people, set up make contacts with the proper agencies and such based on the experience they had. They were a big help to a lot of our local officials.
And I remember when the Mennonites arrived in the area too. They sent a lot of craftspeople.
One group came down from Elmira in Ontario, Canada, kind of a sister city to us.
That's right.
Came down and labored in the love of the Lord.
Yeah, I guess that progression, following that progression of the build-up to the flood, the aftermath of the flood, there are probably 1 million stories from each one of those areas. The people who came to help us rebuild after the flood, the company that we worked for, providing us with more equipment, helping us to cover the story.
The Genesee Brewing Company sent in truckloads of bottled water.
That's right.
In Genesee bottles.
Yep. They ran a special bottling run of Genesee beer bottles filled with drinking water.
I wish I'd saved one of those as a souvenir.
Because a lot of people lost electricity and natural gas supplies were cut off. A lot of people had to use Coleman stoves and lanterns. I remember the Coleman Company sent in truckloads of Coleman fuel. I'm not sure if they donated it, but it was like 50 cents a gallon. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah, there were a lot of companies like that responded. And I guess that was another thing that surprised me, that in Elmira, little old Elmira, we were recognized from around the state and around the country, and things flooded in from all over.
Mm-hmm.
FEMA came in with trailers and set up living accommodations for
Can
people.
you remember the ranks and ranks of trailers down at Dunfield?
I do indeed.
Yes.
And they
Remember,
were
I'm sorry, Bruce.
slowly apportioned out to the citizens in need of housing.
Mhm.
Remember they set up a trailer development up in Breesport, up near the county home facility, on county-owned property. That became a little trailer community for a while. And I'm sure there were others, but that's one I remember.
Well, I guess all in all, what I remember is there were so many people who volunteered, who came in and who rebuilt or helped to rebuild the city of Elmira following the flood.
One of the sad sights to me was walking behind the then Steele Memorial Library, not this building that we're in now. It was located several blocks to the east. They had a lot of books housed in the basement that didn't get moved out until after the flood. They were destroyed. I walked behind the library one day and saw them, just hundreds and hundreds of books, sodden, mud-filled, piled up behind that library building. It broke my heart.
It broke a lot of people's heart because that same thing happened in people's homes.
Mm-hmm.
Books.
Family photographs.
Family photographs. Everything was so sodden with mud, and there was so much discussion about how can we save these books, and librarians and book people from all over the United States said there isn't much you can do. There isn't anything you can do to save these things.
My memory of saving things, a couple days before the flood, I was able to buy a set of three-way Utah speakers, big floor speakers, from a stereo system from former Chemung Electronics on East Church Street. And they still exist today, only because I bought them a couple days before the flood, because eventually
That was all flooded.
that was all flooded, and
Yeah.
everything in Chemung Electronics was destroyed. And I often remember, too, thinking of the tools and the power equipment that got lost at Sears. I mean, everything at Sears was destroyed. Good.
Let me ask you this, and this is my one memory that was burned into my mind. Remember when we were in Big Flats? There was a house on the big curve going down into the flats, and water was
I smell
coming.
something coming.
Yeah,
in.
that's exactly right. We watched a mother skunk and her litter, and it was tragic for the skunk, and you watched her. The house was right in the floodplain, and the water was coming up, and she was at a cellar window, and it was so human looking. She's pounding on the cellar window, trying to get in or get away from the water, and everybody that was there, the police, the fire departments, were afraid of being sprayed, and this poor skunk, that was the last thing she had on her mind. She was trying to save her kits.
Of course, snakes and rabbits and everything else, swam if they could to get to
And
higher ground.
The large trucks that were trucking out the
Cows.
dairy cows from that big
Smith-owned
flats.
farms.
Yeah,
Smith-owned farms.
Smith-owned farms.
Yeah.
A lot of,
The impact upon so many individuals, almost to the point of, I'm not a psychiatrist, but people for months, if not years afterwards.
over years.
I think decades.
We had a heavy rainstorm, they panicked.
I think people still have that mentality if they went through that.
When I retired finally from the air in 2006, one of the last things I said to the weather people when I left was, do not ever mention the word flood without characterizing it. Is it a flash flood? Is it for streams and creeks? Is it for small rivers? You must tell these people.
Make it very clear.
Make it very clear, because even in 2006, from 1972, these people, when they hear the word flood, man, it strikes home.
I would be willing to wager that there are still houses, especially on the south side of Elmira. If you went in and you pulled apart a partition, you'd find flood mud in it.
I'm sure you would.
Absolutely, yeah.
It permeated everything.
It permeated things to the point where I suspect if it gets humid enough in some of those houses today, you might
get that odor.
You might get that odor, a little mustiness.
And then it dried, and it caked, and it broke up, and it became dust.
Yeah.
And you went down the street, you smelled it in the dust that blew in your face.
Yeah, but it's amazing how a few rains later, the shrubs were green, the sidewalks were clean, the streets were clean. It's, you know.
The flood coined one word.
Oh, yes, we all remember that.
Police officer.
Don't give him his name.
I won't give his name.
All right.
Radioing in and saying, you got to get somebody down here. There's a big pile of dirbus in the road.
Of course, he meant debris, but
He probably had never run across the word before.
I think he'd run across it, he just didn't know how to pronounce it.
Well, we can sit here today looking back on those times and laughing about it, but at the time, when you're sweaty and dirty and you haven't changed your clothes in 2 or 3 days and you haven't had a lot to eat, except for peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that they brought up from the jail. You remember that? And then they started bringing in food from any place that was above water.
Gee, all I had to do was go home and eat.
That's right.
I lived 5 minutes away from the
That's
station.
true. The rest, well, I didn't go home there for a long
Well,
time.
you're welcome to come, Carl.
I know, and you invited me down. I
Did I?
remember. You and Jeannie, your beloved wife. She's a sweetheart. And I guess people who didn't get flooded were probably a myriad number. But boy, did they kick in, you know.
Mm-hmm.
They called, they said, can we get you guys anything? We haven't been on, you know, have you got clothes, you got water, you got things to eat?
One of my experiences, a few days, maybe a week after, I was over in the Houghton plot in northeast Corning
Mm-hmm.
with a cameraman. We were going down the street talking with people. Man said, you want to see my kitchen? Yeah. Stepped up onto his back porch, wiped off my feet, stepped through the back door into an inch of mud.
You were wiping your feet. Yeah. I don't recall, but I'm sure between Corning, which is, of course, west of us, northwest of us, the Corning Museum of Glass, those places were hard hit, and they also had a loss of life up there, did they not?
There were a
remember how
total of
many?
something like 17 or 18 deaths.
Mm-hmm.
There was a rumor at one point that there were refrigerator trucks, parked over in one of the motel parking lots.
And they were using them for
Using them
morgues.
as temporary morgues.
I remember that rumor.
I think Lodge on the Green is where a lot of the lives were lost. That's where the Tioga River and the Cohocton and Canisteel, they kind of form. That's where the Chemung River begins, but they all converge there.
I guess we could probably wrap this up with the feelings of the people who predict these things. They, after the flood of 72, built 2 or 3 dams to hold back the water of a few rivers like the Tioga, and there was the Tioga-Hammond Dam built. But the largest part of the watershed of the Chemung River Valley remains undammed and uncontrolled to this day. And the question that has been raised many times since 1972 is something like the flood of 72, is it possible to have again? And the answer to that always is, It's not. Will it happen again? It's when
Yeah.
will it happen?
Because if the heavier rain falls on the New York side of the border,
That's right.
like in Steuben County, yeah,
If you look,
it could still happen.
right. If
The
you
dams have helped, but it could still happen.
still happen. If you look at the watershed, if it were drawn out, you put your two hands out and you put your thumbs together and you look at all your fingers spread out. Those are the valleys where the water flows into the Chemung River. And when it gets to Elmira, the
The
Chemung
Old
River.
Point Down River.
That's right, and it's a very narrow watershed. It's a very narrow river, and it's so possible to happen again that.
Let me mention this. Rod kind of shook me up. When I got into the parking lot up at the station one day, and I discovered there he had his boat trailer and boat behind him on his car. I thought, what does he know that I don't know?
Yep. Yeah, he had that from day one. I mean, that Thursday, wasn't it? You packed everything up?
I don't, yeah, well, Thursday I think I probably attached the boat, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was ready.
You were ready for anything.
Actually, my brother provided, a lot of people volunteered their boats. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
because they needed it to rescue people.
Mhm.
Remember my brother Leroy donated his boat. You just turn it over to the firemen and let them go and, rescue the people that they need. A lot of people did that, not only him, but a lot of people did that. A lot of people, and you've got to remember that there were literally thousands that were homeless for a while in Elmira. But yet, there were very few in shelters, considering a lot of people went, and this area is, like the rest of the country, I hope, a lot of friends and neighbors took people in for days and weeks, and so a lot of, there was a lot of help to those less fortunate in that regard too.
And we're talking about one small area that this hurricane flooded, Corning, Elmira. But it started a little bit further north and west, and it went all the way to the Chesapeake Bay, flooding everything in between.
Well, Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area was...
Harrisburg.
Harrisburg.
And actually, I think it started and hit the southern states first. It came up through. Thing is, it got up here and decided to take a rest, just hung around a day or two too long.
Okay, here's a question. Does anybody remember the name of the hurricane that spawned all this?
Agnes.
Okay. We didn't mention that. I don't think so. I think
Hurricane Agnes.
Hurricane Agnes.
Yes, one of the nation's worst hurricanes.
It wasn't a Katrina, but it was an Agnes, and we felt the brunt of it.
A lot of lives were lost. I'm thinking 130 some, maybe, well over 100. Up and down the eastern seaboard. We were not the only ones that suffered. A lot of people suffered.
And it finally ended up in Havre de Grace, Maryland, where the Susquehanna joins the Chesapeake Bay.
Can I ask you guys, what did you see as the role of your news station at that time and for maybe the weeks following?
Well, of course, many of our viewers weren't there. They'd been evacuated. But to those who were at home, who still had radio, or still had electricity and could watch television, we were a primary source of information. And we just threw out all the programming. We just stayed on the air and pumped out the information as fast as we could.
Where people could go for assistance, what agencies that they needed to contact for various services.
Urging people to let us know where they were because other people were inquiring about them. People were evacuated and didn't have a chance to tell their relatives where they were going, or didn't have a way to tell them where they were. So,
And as we mentioned before, ancillary, in addition to letting all of the people know on the air what was going on, we were also working in the background, helping other agencies find people who were missing or find where they had been evacuated to. So we had a lot of jobs at that time.
I remember getting a call from someone in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, thanking us for being on the air because we were their only contact with the outside world. So, obviously people without power and without battery-operated televisions, we were little used to them. For those, with a lot of people, still had power, and maybe they weren't in the flood, but they were obviously very curious as to what was going on and how, people, their relatives and friends might be suffering, so they wanted to know, where the waters were and how bad it was. And
one of the most important messages we carried on the air was, do not go into a flooded area. Do not go into a flooded area, because neighbors in a street, a little neighborhood, would throw rocks and bricks because people would get in their cars who had not been flooded and would drive into these areas up and down just to see and sightsee and gawk at all of the people trying to clean out their houses. And there was a little bit of anger and animosity and reaction from people who had lost almost everything.
All right. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
We lived, we survived.
Yes, we did have another scare with Eloise a couple years later. And that got close to the top of the dikes, but didn't quite come over.
That was the Father's Day. They called it the Father's Day.
This was, I think, in September.
Tropical Storm Beryl.
No. Oh, I don't.
Well, I remember the
Eloise,
Father's Day flood.
Yeah, that was I think, a series of thunderstorms. Very severe, yeah. But Eloise was in September, I think, of either 73 or 74. But it was spooked everybody. I mean, it spooked everyone.
Yeah.
It came to within about a foot of topping the dike, and then fortunately receded.
Just remember, don't use the word flood again.
We're going to have some high water, Carl.
That's right.
Did you have a sign off or anything on your news? Did you have
No, I don't think we signed off the news for
pretty much continuous operation.
all the time.
You mean, did we have some kind of saying at the end of each newscast? I guess, good night, Chief.
I do remember one thing, Rod. You and I put together a Saturday night newscast. A week later, 10 days after the flood, we got everything filmed, stories all put together, and a few minutes before 11 o'clock, out went all the lights, out went all the power. Some people, we won't say who they were, driving Hillcrest Road, ran off the road and took out a power pole and shut off the power to the station.
Yeah, it's the only time we were without power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When the mics are...
And it didn't stay long because the Big Flats power station came back up and started feeding from the other direction. Mm-hmm. But it was enough to knock out the 11 o'clock news.
A couple of things I remember. I ended up with a 6.5 or 6 gallon Johnson boat motor tank that I found floating and ended up in my, neighbor's, some friend's yard or something. So I had that for years. Another thing I remember are the lines of people arriving at the old Remington Rand building, where agencies that donated clothing. There were long tables and people would lost all their clothing. Families would go there and sort through the clothing just to get, but there were thousands of shirts and slacks and baby items and such. People had donated, and that's Remington Rand was an area where that stuff was accessible or available to the people that had been flooded.
I think the only thing that I can think of is that in today, the 23rd of June, 2009, I think not only the country, but the state and the city and the county are a little more prepared and a little better prepared to handle something like this.
Well, today you have cell phones, but you know what? What if the cell phone tower gets flooded? May not have any communications again, so things really change.
If the tower on Holly Hill gets flooded, buddy, we're in deep doo-doo.
We better have a very large boat.
Yeah. How about an ark?
I still have my boat. I'll bring it. We'll be ready.